The October rain drummed against the windows of Thornton Antiquarian Books, like skeletal fingers tapping on glass. Margaret Thornton pushed her wire-rimmed glasses up her nose and surveyed the towering stacks of donated books that had arrived that morning from the Whitmore estate. The elderly collector had passed away 3 weeks ago, leaving behind a lifetime's accumulation of rare volumes, manuscripts, and curiosities that his heirs were eager to dispose of. Margaret had been running her small bookshop on Federal Street in Salem for 15 years, long enough to develop an eye for valuable items hidden among estate donations. She methodically worked through each box, cataloguing first editions and setting aside items of particular interest. The familiar musty scent of old paper and leather bindings filled her nostrils as she handled each volume with practiced care. It was nearly closing time when she reached the final crate, a heavy wooden box that had been packed with newspaper from 1987. As she lifted out a collection of local history books, something slipped from between the pages of a volume about Salem's Victorian architecture. A photograph fluttered to the floor like a falling leaf. Margaret bent to retrieve it, her fingers immediately recognizing the weight and texture of an original albumen print. The sepia-toned image showed a young girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, standing on the wraparound porch of an elaborate Victorian house painted in what appeared to be a distinctive blue shade, though the monochrome photograph made it difficult to be certain. The girl wore a white dress with puffy sleeves and dark stockings, her hair arranged in ringlets that framed a solemn face. Her eyes seemed to stare directly at the camera with an intensity that made Margaret slightly uncomfortable. She flipped the photograph over and found an inscription in faded brown ink. Eleanor Whitmore, 47 Chestnut Street, Salem, Mass., October 1896. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added, "The girl who waited." Margaret frowned. She knew Salem's historic district intimately, having lived there her entire life. Chestnut Street was just 6 blocks from her shop, lined with some of the city's most beautiful 19th-century homes, but she couldn't recall ever seeing a blue Victorian at number 47. The address was familiar, though she couldn't quite place why. Thunder rumbled overhead as she examined the photograph more closely under her desk lamp. The house in the image was magnificent, with ornate gingerbread trim, bay windows, and a distinctive turret that rose 3 stories. The architectural details were crisp and clear, suggesting the photographer had been skilled and the equipment of high quality. Yet something about the image disturbed her beyond the girl's penetrating stare. The shadows fell wrong somehow. The light on the house seemed to come from multiple directions, creating an almost ethereal quality that defied the laws of physics. And the girl's expression held a sadness that seemed too deep for someone so young, as if she had witnessed sorrows beyond her years. Margaret glanced at the clock. It was past 6, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. She should lock up and head home to her apartment above the shop, but the photograph held her attention like a magnet. There was something compelling about the image, something that made her reluctant to simply file it away with the other estate items. Instead, she slipped the photograph into her purse and began the familiar ritual of closing the shop. As she turned off the lights and locked the front door, she couldn't shake the feeling that the girl in the photograph was somehow watching her, waiting for something Margaret didn't yet understand. The walk to her apartment took her past the old Salem cemetery, where weathered headstones jutted from the ground like broken teeth. In the gathering darkness and steady rain, the cemetery looked particularly foreboding. Margaret hurried past, but not before noticing a figure standing motionless among the graves. She paused, squinting through the rain, but when lightning illuminated the cemetery a moment later, the figure was gone. Probably just shadows and her overactive imagination, she told herself as she climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment. But as she settled into her favorite armchair with a cup of tea and the mysterious photograph, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about that solitary figure in the cemetery and the girl who seemed to be waiting on a porch that might not exist. Margaret woke the next morning with the photograph on her nightstand, exactly where she had placed it before falling asleep, yet she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that it had been moved during the night. The girl's expression seemed different somehow, more expectant, as if she were on the verge of speaking. After a quick breakfast of coffee and toast, Margaret bundled up against the crisp October air and walked the 6 blocks to Chestnut Street. The historic neighborhood was one of Salem's most prestigious, lined with impeccably maintained Federal and Victorian homes that housed wealthy families and successful professionals. She had walked these streets countless times over the years, yet as she approached the address from the photograph, A strange anxiety began to build in her chest. The house numbers progressed in perfect order, 43, 45, and then a sudden gap where 47 should have been. In its place sat an empty lot, perhaps 30 feet wide, covered with yellowing grass, and bordered by a low stone wall that looked as old as the surrounding homes. Ancient oak trees grew at odd angles, their gnarled branches reaching toward the Victorian houses on either side, as if trying to bridge an impossible distance. Margaret stood on the sidewalk, staring at the vacant space with growing confusion. She pulled out the photograph and compared it to the lot before her. According to the image, the blue Victorian should have occupied this exact spot, its wraparound porch extending nearly to where she now stood. But there was nothing here except empty ground and the whisper of wind through dying leaves. She approached the low stone wall and noticed that it was constructed from the same granite used in many of Salem's oldest foundations. Moss covered much of its surface, and in several places the mortar had crumbled with age. This wasn't a recent addition to the neighborhood. The wall looked as if it had been there for well over a century. "Can I help you with something?" Margaret jumped at the voice and turned to see an elderly woman emerging from the house at number 45. She was perhaps 70, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Her posture suggested a lifetime of proper breeding and old Salem money. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, slipping the photograph back into her coat pocket. "I was just curious about this empty lot. I'm Margaret Thornton. I run the antiquarian bookshop on Federal Street." The woman's expression softened slightly. "Ah, yes, I know your shop. I'm Eleanor Prescott. My family has lived in this house for 4 generations. She gestured toward the empty lot with a puzzled frown. "That's been vacant for as long as anyone can remember. My great-grandmother used to say there was something odd about that piece of land." "Odd how?" Eleanor moved closer to the stone wall, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper. She claimed that sometimes, on foggy mornings or during heavy rain, she would see the outline of a house there. Just shadows and shapes, mind you. Nothing solid. The neighbors thought she was getting senile, but I remember as a child seeing something similar myself. A trick of the light, probably, or the way the fog settles between the buildings. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "Did your great-grandmother ever mention who might have lived there? If there had been a house, I mean." "That's the strange part," Eleanor said, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "According to city records, that lot has been empty since Salem was incorporated. Never been developed. Never had a building permit filed. But my great-grandmother insisted she remembered playing with a little girl who lived in a blue house right there when she was young. She said the girl's name was Eleanor, same as mine. Family names have a way of repeating in Salem." The coincidence sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. She thought of the inscription on the photograph, Eleanor Whitmore. Could it be the same child that Eleanor Prescott's great-grandmother had claimed to remember? "This might sound like an odd question," Margaret said carefully, "but have you ever heard the name Eleanor Whitmore?" The elderly woman's face went pale. She stared at Margaret with something approaching fear. "Where did you hear that name?" "I found an old photograph. It mentioned someone by that name living at this address in 1896. Eleanor Prescott took a step back from the wall. "My great-grandmother mentioned that name once when I was about 12 years old. She made me promise never to repeat it, said there were some things better left buried. But she's been dead for 30 years now, so I suppose it doesn't matter." She glanced around nervously, as if checking to make sure they weren't being overheard. "She said Eleanor Whitmore was the girl who lived in the blue house, the one she used to play with. But according to great-grandmother, Eleanor never aged, never grew up. She would appear and disappear like morning mist, always standing on that porch, always waiting for someone to come and play." Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her coat pocket where the photograph rested. "What happened to her?" "Nobody knows. One day she was just gone and the house with her. Great-grandmother spent the rest of her life insisting it had all been real, but there was never any proof. No records, no foundations, nothing but an empty lot and an old woman's memories." As if summoned by their conversation, a light fog began to roll in from Salem Harbor, curling around the bare trees and settling into the low places between the houses. Eleanor Prescott shivered and pulled her shawl tighter. "I should go inside," she said quickly. "The fog always makes me nervous, especially around that lot. If you're interested in local history, you might want to check with the Historical Society. They have records going back to the 1600s. Margaret thanked her and watched as the elderly woman hurried back to her house, casting one last worried glance at the empty lot before disappearing inside. As the fog thickened, Margaret could have sworn she saw movement in her peripheral vision, a flash of white dress among the twisted oak trees. But when she turned to look directly, there was nothing there but mist and shadows. The Salem Historical Society occupied a stately brick building on Essex Street that had once served as the town's first bank. Margaret arrived just as the morning fog was beginning to lift, though wisps of it still clung to the building's ivy-covered walls like ghostly fingers. The Society's archives were housed in the basement, a climate-controlled repository of documents, photographs and artifacts that chronicled Salem's long and often dark history. Dr. James Hartwell, the Society's chief archivist, was a thin man in his 60s, with a shock of white hair and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time underground among dusty records. He greeted Margaret with genuine enthusiasm, as he did all researchers who shared his passion for historical accuracy. "Margaret, what brings you down to my dungeon today?" he asked, leading her through rows of filing cabinets and storage boxes. "Another mystery from your bookshop acquisitions?" "Something like that," Margaret replied, pulling out the photograph. "I found this in an estate donation, and I'm having trouble verifying its authenticity. The inscription claims it shows 47 Chestnut Street in 1896, but there's no house at that address." Dr. Hartwell examined the photograph under a magnifying glass, his trained eye taking in every detail of the image and the paper it was printed on. "The photograph appears genuine," he said after a moment. "Album and print consistent with 1890s photography. The paper stock and chemical composition look right for the period. But you're correct about the address. There's never been a structure at 47 Chestnut Street." He gestured for Margaret to follow him to a large map cabinet against the far wall. "I've been researching Salem's architectural history for 40 years, and I can show you definitive proof." Dr. Hartwell pulled out a series of maps and surveys dating from 1692 to the present day. Each one clearly showed the lot at 47 Chestnut Street as vacant, marked with various notations over the centuries: unsuitable for construction, marshy ground, and later simply reserved. "But here's where it gets interesting," he continued, retrieving a leather-bound ledger from a nearby shelf. "In 1895, someone did file a building permit for that address. The application was for a large Victorian residence, estimated cost of construction $8,000, which was substantial money at the time." Margaret leaned in closer as he opened the ledger to a yellowed page filled with spidery handwriting. The applicant was listed as Thomas Whitmore, and the house was described as a 3-story Victorian with wraparound porch and distinctive blue paint. The permit was approved in November 1895. "But if the permit was approved, why was the house never built?" Dr. Hartwell turned to another section of the ledger, his expression growing more puzzled. "That's just it. According to these records, construction was completed in March 1896. There are inspection reports, a certificate of occupancy, even tax assessments for the following year. But then, abruptly, all records stop." He pulled out another document, this one more recent. "In 1897, the city conducted a comprehensive survey of all residential properties for insurance purposes. Every house on Chestnut Street was documented and photographed, except for number 47. The surveyors noted that the lot appeared to be vacant, despite having building records on file." Margaret felt that familiar chill creeping up her spine. "What about the Whitmore family? Are there any records of them?" "That's where the mystery deepens," Dr. Hartwell said, moving to another filing cabinet. "Thomas Whitmore appears in city directories for 1895 and 1896. He's listed as a merchant, married to Catherine Whitmore, with one daughter named Eleanor. But in 1897, their names disappear from all public records. No death certificates, no moving permits, no forwarding addresses. It's as if they simply vanished." He pulled out a manila folder marked with the Whitmore name. Inside were photocopies of various documents: a marriage certificate, a birth certificate for Eleanor dated 1885, business licenses, and bank records. Everything painted the picture of a normal middle-class family establishing themselves in Salem's growing community. "The strange thing is," Dr. Hartwell continued, "several neighbors reported seeing the family regularly throughout 1896. Eleanor was described as a quiet child who often played alone on the front porch of her house. But when the surveyors came through in 1897, none of the neighbors could agree on what had happened to the Whitmores or when they had seen them last." Margaret studied the documents with growing unease. Everything seemed to corroborate the existence of the family and their house, yet physical evidence suggested neither had ever existed. "Have other researchers asked about the Whitmores?" she asked. Dr. Hartwell's expression grew troubled. You're the third person to inquire about this family in the past 20 years. The first was a graduate student from Harvard who was writing her dissertation on missing persons in 19th century New England. She spent weeks in our archives, became completely obsessed with the Whitmore case. What happened to her research? She disappeared, Dr. Hartwell said quietly. Left Salem in the middle of the night without finishing her dissertation. Her professors said she'd suffered some kind of breakdown. The second researcher was a genealogist who'd been hired by someone claiming to be a Whitmore descendant. Same thing happened. He packed up his materials one day and left town, wouldn't return phone calls. Margaret felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. Do you still have their research files? That's the odd part. Both researchers took their files with them, but they left behind the same photograph you've shown me today. Different copies, but identical image and inscription. Dr. Hartwell opened a desk drawer and pulled out a small box. Inside were 2 more photographs of Eleanor Whitmore standing on the porch of the blue Victorian. As Margaret stared at the 3 identical images, she could have sworn the girl's expression changed slightly, as if she were pleased to see her collection growing. The basement suddenly felt much colder, and somewhere in the building above them, a door creaked open, though Margaret was certain they were alone. I think, she said carefully, I need to do some more research on my own. That night, Margaret placed the photograph on her nightstand as she had the previous evening, but sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself standing on Chestnut Street, staring at the empty lot where the blue Victorian should have been. In these half-waking visions, the fog rolled in from the harbour, and through its grey curtains she could see the ghostly outline of a house taking shape among the twisted oak trees. When she finally drifted off near dawn, her dreams were vivid and disturbing. She found herself walking up the front steps of the blue Victorian, her hand trailing along the ornate banister as she approached the wraparound porch. The house was magnificent in her dream, painted a deep cerulean blue that seemed to shimmer in the afternoon sunlight. Gingerbread trim decorated every eave and corner, and stained glass windows cast rainbow patterns across the wooden floor. Eleanor Whitmore stood waiting on the porch, just as she appeared in the photograph, but in the dream, the girl was alive, her dark eyes following Margaret's approach with intense curiosity. She wore the same white dress with puffy sleeves, but now Margaret could see the delicate lace trim and the small mother-of-pearl buttons that fastened the bodice. You found my picture, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the formal cadence of the Victorian era. I've been waiting such a long time for someone to come. Margaret tried to speak but found her voice caught in her throat. The girl stepped closer, and Margaret noticed that her feet made no sound on the wooden porch boards. The others came before you, but they were frightened. They ran away before we could really talk. Will you stay and play with me? Before Margaret could answer, the dream shifted. The house began to fade around the edges, becoming translucent like a photographic negative. Eleanor's expression turned desperate, her small hands reaching out as if to grasp something that was slipping away. Don't leave, the girl pleaded. Please don't leave me alone again. Margaret woke with a gasp, her heart pounding and cold sweat beading on her forehead. Pale morning light filtered through her bedroom curtains, and the photograph still sat on her nightstand. But something had changed. The girl's position was slightly different. Her right hand now extended as if she were reaching toward the camera, toward whoever might be looking at her across the barrier of time. Margaret dressed quickly and went downstairs to open the bookshop, but she found it difficult to concentrate on her usual tasks. Customers came and went, browsing the shelves and making purchases, yet she felt disconnected from it all, as if she were watching the world through a window. Her thoughts kept returning to the dream and the girl's desperate plea not to be left alone. During her lunch break, she walked back to Chestnut Street. In daylight, the empty lot looked ordinary enough, just another piece of undeveloped land in Salem's historic district. But as she stood by the stone wall, Margaret began to notice details that had escaped her attention before. The ground inside the lot wasn't entirely level. There were subtle depressions and raised areas that, if she squinted and used her imagination, might correspond to the foundation and layout of a large house. Near what would have been the front of the property, a cluster of antique daffodils grew in a neat rectangle, as if someone had once planted a flower garden there. More disturbing were the paths worn into the grass. Faint but unmistakable, they traced patterns that made no sense for an empty lot. One path curved from the sidewalk toward the center of the property, exactly where front steps might once have led to a porch. Another circled the perimeter, following the route a wraparound porch would have taken. As Margaret studied these phantom pathways, she became aware of being watched. She turned to find a man in his 40s standing on the sidewalk behind her, his dark suit and serious expression marking him as either a professional or someone attending a funeral. He had been staring at the lot with the same intense focus she had been showing. "Fascinating, isn't it?" he said, approaching the stone wall. "The way the land holds memory even when everything else is gone." Margaret felt a surge of unease. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" "Dr. Michael Reeves," he said, extending his hand. "I'm a psychiatrist from Boston. I specialize in cases involving unexplained phenomena and their psychological effects." She shook his hand reluctantly. "Margaret Thornton. I run the bookshop on Federal Street. What brings you to Salem?" Dr. Reeves glanced around nervously before answering. "I had a patient, a graduate student who suffered a complete psychological breakdown after researching a local historical mystery. She became obsessed with a family called Whitmore and claimed to be receiving visits from a dead child. I thought if I could understand what triggered her episode, I might be able to help her." Margaret's blood ran cold. "The Harvard student who was writing about missing persons? You know about Jessica?" Dr. Reeves looked surprised. "She's been institutionalized for 3 years now. She insists that a Victorian girl named Eleanor is trying to communicate with her through photographs. She draws the same house over and over, always in blue crayon, always with a girl standing on the porch." From her coat pocket, Margaret slowly withdrew the photograph. Dr. Reeves stared at it with obvious recognition and fear. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. "I found it yesterday in some donated books. But I think it might have found me." Dr. Reeves took a step back from the wall. "Jessica had an identical photograph. She claimed it moved on its own, that the girl's expression changed depending on her mood. I assumed it was part of her delusion until I saw the picture myself. There were times when I could have sworn the child was looking directly at me. The fog was beginning to roll in from the harbor again, just as it had the day before. As it crept between the houses and settled into the empty lot, Margaret felt the familiar chill of otherworldly presence. "Dr. Reeves," she said quietly, "I think we need to talk." Margaret and Dr. Reeves retreated to her bookshop as the fog thickened around Chestnut Street. The familiar surroundings of leather-bound volumes and antique furniture provided some comfort, though Margaret noticed that Dr. Reeves kept glancing nervously at the windows, as if expecting to see something peering in from the mist-shrouded street. "Tell me about Jessica," Margaret said, settling into the chair behind her desk while Dr. Reeves took the seat across from her. The photograph lay between them like a bridge connecting their separate encounters with the impossible. Dr. Reeves removed a small digital recorder from his briefcase. "I've brought some of our sessions with me. Jessica gave permission for me to share them, if it would help solve what she calls Eleanor's mystery. With your permission, I'd like you to hear her story in her own words." Margaret nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to know what had driven a graduate student to madness. Dr. Reeves pressed play, and the room filled with the sound of a young woman's voice, strained and weary but coherent. "It started with the photograph," Jessica's recorded voice began. "I found it in the Harvard archives, misfiled with some documents about Salem witch trial descendants. At first, it was just another research lead. I was tracking families who had disappeared from historical records, trying to understand patterns of migration and social mobility in 19th century New England." Margaret leaned forward, recognizing the academic tone she had often heard from researchers who visited her shop. "The Whitmores seemed like a perfect case study," Jessica continued. "A middle-class family with good documentation up until 1896, then complete silence. I thought it would be straightforward. Maybe they had moved west like so many families during that period. But when I went to Salem to check local records, I discovered the impossibility of their existence." Dr. Reeves paused the recording. "This is where her rational academic approach began to break down. She found the same discrepancies you've encountered. The building permits for a house that supposedly never existed, the family records with no corresponding physical evidence." He resumed the playback. Jessica's voice had grown more agitated. "I started having dreams about the Blue House. Every night I would find myself standing in front of 47 Chestnut Street, but instead of an empty lot, there would be this magnificent Victorian home. Eleanor would be waiting on the porch, always in that same white dress. She looked so lonely, so desperate for company." Margaret felt a chill of recognition. Her own dream the night before had been remarkably similar. At first, the dreams were pleasant. "Eleanor and I would sit on the porch and talk. She told me about her life in 1896, about her parents and their plans for the future. She seemed like any normal child, except she never aged, never changed. It was always the same conversation, the same afternoon in October 1896. The recording crackled with static, and when Jessica's voice returned, it carried an edge of fear. Then, things began happening during my waking hours. I would be working in the archives, and I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a flash of white dress, the sound of a child's laughter. The photograph I was using for reference began to change. Eleanor's expression would shift throughout the day, sometimes sad, sometimes hopeful, sometimes angry. Dr. Reeves stopped the recorder again. This is when Jessica first contacted me. She was experiencing what psychologists call intrusive hallucinations, but she insisted they were real interactions with a supernatural entity. I initially treated her with standard therapy for research-induced stress, but her symptoms continued to escalate. What kind of escalation? Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. She began to see Eleanor everywhere, not just in dreams or peripheral vision, but standing in her apartment, sitting in lecture halls, following her around campus. The child would speak to her, begging Jessica to help her return home, to find a way back to her family. The recording resumed with Jessica's voice, now barely above a whisper. Eleanor told me she's been trapped since 1896, caught between the world of the living and whatever comes after. She said the photograph is like a window, a way for her to reach out to people who might be able to help her. But everyone who finds the picture eventually abandons her and she's left alone again. Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her coat pocket where her copy of the photograph rested. She was beginning to understand why the previous researchers had fled Salem. The last entry in Jessica's research journal is particularly disturbing, Dr. Reeves said, pulling out a photocopied page covered in cramped handwriting. She wrote it the night before she was found wandering Chestnut Street in her nightgown, completely catatonic. He handed Margaret the page. The handwriting became increasingly erratic as it progressed, but the message was clear. Eleanor says there's a way to free her, but it requires someone to take her place. Someone has to willingly enter the Blue House and stay with her, so she won't be alone anymore. She's been waiting so long, and she's so tired of being forgotten. I can hear her calling my name from the empty lot. She's standing on the porch, reaching out her hand. Maybe if I just took it, we could both find peace. Margaret set the page down with trembling fingers. Outside, the fog had grown so thick that she could barely see the street lamps through her shop windows. And somewhere in that grey shroud, she could have sworn she heard the faint sound of a child's voice calling her name. "Dr. Reeves," she said quietly, "I think Eleanor has found her next candidate." Dr. Reeves packed away his recorder with shaking hands. "Margaret, I need to tell you about the second researcher, the genealogist who came after Jessica. His experience might be even more relevant to your situation." Margaret poured herself a cup of tea from the electric kettle she kept behind the counter, her hands steadier than she felt. The fog outside had grown so dense that the street had disappeared entirely, leaving her shop feeling isolated from the rest of the world. "His name was David Chen," Dr. Reeves continued. "He contacted me after reading about Jessica's case in a psychiatric journal. He claimed to have been hired by someone calling himself Thomas Whitmore, Jr., who said he was researching his family genealogy. David was paid handsomely to trace the Whitmore lineage and find out what had happened to his great-grandfather's family." Margaret set down her teacup with a soft clink. "But there are no surviving Whitmores. The family disappeared in 1897. "Exactly. When David tried to contact his employer after several weeks of research, the phone number had been disconnected. The address he'd been given led to another empty lot in Boston. The checks he'd been paid with were drawn on an account that the bank claimed had never existed." Dr. Reeves pulled out another folder from his briefcase. David was methodical in his research. He documented everything, including his growing suspicions that something supernatural was involved. Unlike Jessica, who was drawn in by the emotional appeal of a lonely child, David approached the mystery from a scientific perspective. He spread several pages of notes across Margaret's desk. David's handwriting was precise and analytical, filled with charts, timelines, and cross-references that painted a comprehensive picture of the Whitmore investigation. David discovered something Jessica had missed, Dr. Reeves explained. The building permits and tax records for 47 Chestnut Street weren't just filed, they were renewed annually from 1896 through 1923. Someone was paying property taxes on a house that didn't exist for nearly 30 years. Margaret scanned the documents with growing amazement. Who was making the payments? That's where it gets interesting. The tax payments came from a trust fund established by Thomas Whitmore in 1895. The fund was specifically designated to maintain the property at 47 Chestnut Street in perpetuity, with instructions that it never be sold or developed by anyone else. Dr. Reeves pointed to a bank document dated 1924. The payment stopped abruptly when the trust fund was exhausted. But here's the strange part. According to bank records, Thomas Whitmore continued to make deposits into the trust account long after he had supposedly disappeared. The last deposit was made in December 1923, 26 years after the family vanished from public records. Margaret felt that familiar chill creeping up her spine. How is that possible? David theorized that Thomas Whitmore didn't actually disappear. He believed that Whitmore discovered something about the lot at 47 Chestnut Street, something that trapped his family in a kind of temporal loop. David's notes suggest that Whitmore spent the rest of his life trying to maintain some connection to his wife and daughter, even though they existed in a different reality. Dr. Reeves turned to another page covered with David's increasingly frantic handwriting. As David's research progressed, he began experiencing the same phenomena as Jessica: dreams of the Blue House, encounters with Eleanor, and a growing compulsion to solve what he called the Whitmore paradox. But David had an advantage that Jessica lacked. He understood he was being manipulated. Margaret leaned forward to read David's final research notes. The handwriting had deteriorated significantly, and several passages were crossed out or rewritten multiple times. Eleanor isn't just a lonely child seeking companionship, David had written. She's a psychic anchor, keeping her family trapped in a reality that no longer exists. The house, the family, the entire situation exists in a pocket of time that was severed from our timeline in 1896. Eleanor's connection to our world through the photograph is the only thing preventing the pocket from collapsing entirely. The next paragraph was heavily crossed out, but Margaret could still make out most of the words. She's not trying to escape her situation. She's trying to expand it. Each person who becomes obsessed with the mystery strengthens her connection to our reality. If enough people cross over, she might be able to merge her pocket timeline with our own, bringing the Blue House back into existence. Margaret looked up at Dr. Reeves with growing alarm. What happened to David? He disappeared 3 days after writing that final entry. His landlord found his apartment empty except for his research materials and 3 identical photographs of Eleanor Whitmore. David's family hired a private investigator, but no trace of him was ever found. Dr. Reeves gathered up the papers and returned them to his folder. Margaret, I came to Salem hoping to understand what drives people to obsession over this case, but now I'm beginning to think the obsession isn't naturally occurring. I think Eleanor is actively selecting her targets, drawing in people who have the knowledge and skills she needs to accomplish her goal. Outside, the fog seemed to be pressing against the windows with unnatural persistence. Margaret could no longer see any of the streetlights, and the silence was so complete that she wondered if the rest of Salem still existed beyond the grey shroud surrounding her shop. Dr. Reeves, she said quietly, I don't think we're alone in here anymore. In the reflection of the darkened window, Margaret could see the faint outline of a small figure in a white dress, standing perfectly still in the corner of her shop, where no one should have been able to enter. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the reflection in the window. The small figure stood motionless in the corner of her shop, translucent but unmistakably present. Dr. Reeves followed her gaze and went rigid in his chair, his face draining of color as he saw what she was seeing. Don't turn around, Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. Don't look directly at her. But even as she spoke, the reflection began to move. Eleanor Whitmore stepped away from the corner, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. In the window's reflection, Margaret could see the child's face clearly now, no longer confined to the sepia tones of the photograph. Eleanor's skin was pale as porcelain, her dark hair arranged in perfect ringlets, and her eyes held an intelligence far beyond her apparent years. You've been asking about me, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the formal speech patterns of the Victorian era, but with an undertone of something ancient and weary. I can hear your questions echoing across the years. Dr. Reeves started to turn, but Margaret grabbed his arm. She's stronger when you look at her directly. David Chen figured that out. Stay focused on the reflection. Eleanor moved closer and Margaret could see her more clearly in the window's surface. The white dress was exquisite, with layers of lace and tiny pearl buttons, but there was something wrong with the fabric. It seemed to shift and flow like water, never quite maintaining the same texture from moment to moment. You found my photograph, Eleanor continued, her reflection now standing directly behind Margaret's chair. That's how I knew you would understand. You care about old things, forgotten things. You know how it feels when history tries to erase someone. Margaret forced herself to remain calm, drawing on years of experience, dealing with rare and often disturbing historical artifacts. Eleanor, what happened to your family? Why are you trapped? The child's reflection smiled, but it was not the innocent expression of a 10-year-old. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting far too long for the right questions to be asked. Papa was so proud of our house, Eleanor said, moving to stand beside Dr. Reeves. He said it would be the most beautiful home in Salem, painted blue, like the ocean he loved so much. Mama planted gardens all around the porch, and I had my own room in the turret where I could see the harbor. The reflection began to pace back and forth behind them, her movements becoming more agitated. But the lot was wrong. Papa didn't know about the old foundation buried beneath the soil, or the family that had lived there before Salem was Salem. The Nipmuc people had sacred ground there, a place where they spoke to spirits. Papa's house was built on top of their ceremonial circle. Margaret felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. Many of Salem's oldest houses had been constructed over Native American sites, often with tragic consequences that local historians preferred not to discuss. When we moved into the house in March 1896, strange things began happening immediately, Eleanor continued. Time moved differently inside our walls. Minutes would stretch into hours, or entire days would pass in what felt like moments. Mama aged 10 years in the first month, while I remained exactly as I was. Dr. Reeves was taking notes, his hand trembling as he wrote. In the window's reflection, Eleanor noticed his actions and her expression darkened. Papa tried to get us out, but the house wouldn't let us leave. Every time we walked through the front door, we would find ourselves back on the porch as if we had never moved at all. The neighbors could see us for a while, waving from the windows, playing in the garden, but we were becoming less real with each passing day. The reflection moved closer to Margaret, and she could feel a coldness emanating from the space where Eleanor stood. By October, we had faded so much that only children could see us clearly. That's when Papa made his terrible choice. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. What did he do? He found a way to anchor us to your world, to keep us from disappearing entirely. But the anchor could only hold one of us, and it required a permanent connection to someone in your timeline. Eleanor's reflection reached out as if to touch Margaret's shoulder. Papa chose me because I was the youngest, because I had the most life left to live. He bound me to a photograph and condemned me to an eternity of waiting for someone to set me free. The fog outside began to swirl more violently, and Margaret could hear the distant sound of waves crashing, though Salem Harbor was miles away. What happened to your parents? They faded away completely by Christmas 1896. I watched them become transparent, then translucent, then nothing at all. But I remained, trapped in that moment on the porch, calling out to anyone who might hear me. Eleanor's reflection turned to face them directly. I've been so lonely, Margaret. A century and more of solitude, with only brief visits from people like Jessica and David to break the monotony. Dr. Reeves looked up from his notes. Eleanor, what do you want from us? The child's smile returned, but now it was tinged with desperation. I want to go home. I want my family back, and I know how to get them. Her reflection began to solidify, becoming less transparent with each word. All I need is for someone to willingly take my place as the anchor, someone to stand guard while I gather enough spiritual energy to pull my parents back from wherever they've gone. Margaret felt a terrible understanding wash over her. That's what happened to David Chen. He agreed to help you. David was so smart, so analytical. He understood the mechanics of my situation perfectly, but when the moment came to make the exchange, he lost his nerve. He's with me now in the Blue House, keeping me company while I wait for someone braver. The reflection was now completely solid, and Eleanor began to turn away from the window. I think you might be that someone, Margaret. You have the right kind of loneliness, the right appreciation for forgotten history, and you're already more connected to my world than you realize. Before Margaret could respond, Eleanor stepped out of the reflection and into the room itself, no longer confined to the window's surface. She stood before them in 3 dimensions, a living Victorian child in a world she no longer belonged to, her dark eyes fixed on Margaret with ancient hope and terrible need. Eleanor stood in Margaret's bookshop with impossible solidity, her presence transforming the familiar space into something otherworldly. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and frost was beginning to form on the inside of the windows, despite the October warmth outside. Books on nearby shelves started to flutter their pages as if blown by an unfelt wind. Don't be afraid, Eleanor said, extending her small hand toward Margaret. "I know this must be overwhelming, but I've waited so very long for someone who could truly understand." Dr. Reeves slowly rose from his chair, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. "Eleanor, you said David is with you in the Blue House. Is he alive? Can we speak with him?" The child turned her attention to the psychiatrist, and her expression became almost pitying. "David is safe, but he exists in my time now. He ages differently there, thinks differently. Your world moves so quickly that it would be painful for him to return, even if he could." Margaret remained seated, fighting the strange compulsion to reach out and take Eleanor's offered hand. There was something hypnotic about the child's presence, a pull that seemed to bypass rational thought and appeal directly to some deeper part of her psyche. "Show us," Margaret said quietly. "Show us the Blue House." Eleanor's face brightened with genuine joy, the first truly childlike expression Margaret had seen from her. "You want to see it? You want to see my home?" The air in the bookshop began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The walls became translucent, then transparent, and suddenly Margaret found herself looking through them at an impossible vista. Where Federal Street should have been, she saw Chestnut Street as it had existed in 1896, complete with gas lamps, cobblestone sidewalks, and horse-drawn carriages passing in the distance. And there, occupying the lot that had been empty for over a century, stood the most beautiful Victorian house Margaret had ever seen. It was painted a deep, rich blue that seemed to glow with inner light, every piece of gingerbread trim picked out in white and gold. The wraparound porch was exactly as it appeared in the photograph, complete with wicker furniture and hanging baskets of flowers that bloomed in impossible profusion. "It's magnificent," Margaret breathed, and she meant it. The house was a masterpiece of Victorian architecture, every detail perfect, every line harmonious. Eleanor beamed with pride. "Papa designed it himself. He said it would be our forever home, a place where our family could be happy for generations to come." Her expression clouded. He was right about the forever part, just not in the way he intended. Dr. Reeves was frantically scribbling notes, trying to document everything he was experiencing. "Eleanor, how many people are with you in the house now?" "Besides David, there are 3 others. A woman named Sarah who came to me in 1953, looking for her brother who had died in the war. She wanted to speak with him one more time, and I helped her find him. Then there's Marcus, who arrived in 1978. He was writing a book about American ghost stories and became fascinated with my family's disappearance. And most recently, there's Father Miguel, a Catholic priest who came to perform an exorcism in 1999. Margaret felt a chill of understanding. "They're all still there? All of them trapped like you were?" "Not trapped," Eleanor said, her voice taking on a defensive tone. "They chose to stay. They each found something in my house that they couldn't find in your world. Sarah talks with her brother every day. Marcus has access to every ghost story ever told, can speak with spirits from across the centuries. Father Miguel ministers to souls who are caught between life and death, helping them find peace." The vision of the Blue House wavered, and Margaret caught glimpses of figures moving on the wraparound porch. A woman in 1950s clothing sat in a wicker chair, apparently deep in conversation with someone Margaret couldn't see. A man with shoulder-length hair and bell-bottom pants stood at the railing, writing in a notebook. Near the front door, an elderly man in clerical collar appeared to be praying over a small glowing form. "And David?" Dr. Reeves asked. "What does he do in your house?" Eleanor's smile returned. "David helps me understand the nature of time itself. He's mapping the connections between different temporal pockets, documenting how spirit anchors work across multiple realities. His research there is far more advanced than anything he could have accomplished in your limited world." Margaret stood up slowly, never taking her eyes off the impossible house. "Eleanor, what happens to our world if you succeed in pulling your parents back? What happens to the timeline we exist in?" The child considered the question with disturbing seriousness. "Some things might change. People and places connected to my family's disappearance might remember them differently. The empty lot would become our house again, and neighbors would recall us living there all along, but most people wouldn't notice anything different." Dr. Reeves looked up from his notes. "That's not possible. You can't alter history without creating paradoxes." "History is more flexible than your scientists believe," Eleanor replied. "Time isn't a straight line. It's more like a fabric that can be rewoven if you know the right techniques. My house exists in a fold of that fabric, and with enough spiritual energy, I can smooth out the wrinkle that separated us from your timeline." The bookshop around them continued to fade, becoming increasingly transparent as the vision of 1896 Chestnut Street grew more solid. Margaret realized that she was being drawn into Eleanor's world, whether she chose to go or not. The boundary between the two realities was dissolving, and soon she would have to make a conscious decision about which side of it she wanted to exist on. "Eleanor," she said carefully, "if I come with you to see the house, will I be able to return to my own time?" The child's expression became unreadable. "That depends on what you find there, and how much you want to leave once you've seen all the wonders my world contains." As if to emphasize her point, the vision shifted to show the interior of the blue house. Margaret could see vast libraries filled with books that had never been written, laboratories where impossible experiments were being conducted, and gardens where flowers bloomed in colors that didn't exist in nature. It was a paradise of knowledge and possibility, a place where the constraints of normal reality didn't apply. Hand standing in the doorway, waving at her with desperate hope, was a man in his 30s with David Chen's face, but eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of years spent exploring the mysteries of existence itself. Margaret's bookshop had become almost completely transparent now, existing more as a memory than a physical space. She could feel herself being pulled toward the blue house, drawn by forces that seemed to operate on a level deeper than conscious thought. The Victorian mansion appeared solid and welcoming, its windows glowing with warm lamplight that promised comfort and endless discovery. "Margaret, don't," Dr. Reeves said urgently, grabbing her arm. His touch felt distant, as if he were reaching across a great divide to make contact. "Remember what happened to the others. Remember Jessica." Eleanor turned to face the psychiatrist, and for a moment, her childlike facade slipped entirely. The expression that looked out through her dark eyes was ancient and utterly inhuman, a consciousness that had spent over a century learning to manipulate human emotions and desires. "Dr. Reeves, you misunderstand the nature of what I'm offering," Eleanor said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Margaret's bones. "Jessica wasn't destroyed by her experience with me. She was liberated from a world that couldn't appreciate her gifts. In your psychiatric hospital, she's considered insane because she can see beyond the narrow confines of your reality. But here, in my house, her visions would be recognized as the profound insights they truly are." The vision of the blue house shifted to show Jessica sitting in a sun-drenched parlor, no longer the broken graduate student from Dr. Reeves's recordings. This Jessica was radiant, her face lit with the joy of someone who had found her true calling. She was writing in a leather-bound journal, documenting what appeared to be conversations with historical figures who had been dead for centuries. "She's helping me catalog the stories of everyone who has ever been forgotten by history," Eleanor explained. "Their voices live on in my house, and Jessica gives them the academic framework they need to share their experiences with future generations." Margaret felt herself taking a step toward the vision, then another. The floorboards of her bookshop had become insubstantial beneath her feet, while the porch steps of the blue house felt increasingly real and solid. "This is how it starts," Dr. Reeves called out, his voice growing fainter as the distance between realities increased. "You think you're making a choice, but she's already decided for you. The photograph, the dreams, the gradual isolation from your normal life, it's all part of her process." Eleanor's expression hardened at the psychiatrist's words. "Dr. Reeves represents everything that's wrong with your world. He reduces mystery to pathology, transforms wonder into symptoms to be treated and cured. In his universe, there's no room for magic, no space for the impossible." Margaret paused on the threshold between worlds, one foot on her bookshop floor and the other on the blue house porch. She could feel the pull of both realities, the safe familiarity of her ordinary life competing with the intoxicating promise of Eleanor's supernatural paradise. "Eleanor," she said carefully, "show me what happens if I refuse. Show me what my life would be like if I walked away from all this." The child's face crumpled with disappointment, but she waved her hand, and the vision around them shifted again. Margaret saw herself back in her bookshop, but it was different now. The walls were covered with photographs of Eleanor, dozens of copies of the same image, taken from every angle imaginable. Her customers had stopped coming, disturbed by the obsessive display and Margaret's increasingly erratic behavior. She watched herself growing older and more isolated, spending every waking moment researching the Whitmore family, writing letters to historical societies, and making pilgrimages to the empty lot on Chestnut Street. In this future, she never solved the mystery, never found peace, never escaped the haunting knowledge that she had been chosen for something extraordinary and had turned away from it. "This is what happened to the ones who ran," Eleanor said softly. "They carry the weight of my disappointment for the rest of their lives. They know they glimpsed something miraculous and chose the prison of normalcy instead." Margaret saw herself in this future timeline, old and bitter, dying alone in her apartment above the bookshop with Eleanor's photograph clutched in her arthritic hands, still calling out for the child who would never answer again. "But there's another way," Eleanor continued, and the vision shifted once more. "You could come with me willingly, not as a replacement anchor, but as a true collaborator. Help me gather the spiritual energy I need to reunite my family, and when that work is done, I'll send you back to your own time with knowledge and experiences beyond anything your world could offer." The new vision showed Margaret working alongside David Chen in a vast library that existed within the Blue House. They were documenting supernatural phenomena across multiple timelines, building a comprehensive understanding of how reality worked on its deepest levels. The Margaret in this vision was vibrant and purposeful, her scholarly instincts finally given a mystery worthy of her talents. Dr. Reeves managed to push through the dimensional barrier, his form becoming more solid as he forced himself into Eleanor's domain. "Margaret, she's showing you what you want to see, not what will actually happen. Every person who has crossed over believed they were making a temporary arrangement. None of them have ever returned." Eleanor's childlike mask slipped again, revealing the calculating intelligence beneath. "Dr. Reeves, you're not invited to this conversation. Return to your own reality before you become trapped here as well." But the psychiatrist stood his ground, pulling out his recorder and playing Jessica's voice one more time. "She told me it would only be temporary, that I could leave whenever I wanted. But the longer you stay in the Blue House, the harder it becomes to remember why you ever wanted to leave. The house changes you, makes you need it, until the thought of returning to the ordinary world becomes unbearable." Margaret looked back and forth between Eleanor's promises and Dr. Reeves's warnings, caught between two versions of reality that couldn't both be true. The choice she made in the next few moments would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the fate of everyone Eleanor had collected over the past century. The Blue House waited, patient and beautiful, its doors open and welcoming. And in those doors she could see David Chen and Jessica, Sarah and Marcus and Father Miguel, all of them gesturing for her to join them in their eternal research into the mysteries of existence itself. Margaret stood suspended between worlds, feeling the pull of both realities like opposing magnetic forces, but as she looked more carefully at the figures beckoning from the Blue House, she began to notice details that Eleanor's beautiful visions had glossed over. David Chen's eyes, while filled with accumulated wisdom, also held a deep sadness that seemed to grow stronger the longer she observed him. Jessica's radiant smile flickered occasionally, revealing moments of confusion and loss beneath the surface joy. "Eleanor," Margaret said slowly, "let me speak with David directly. Let me hear from him what his experience has really been like." The child's expression tightened with annoyance, but she couldn't refuse without revealing the manipulative nature of her offer. With a reluctant gesture, she opened a channel of communication between the dimensions. David's voice came through clearly, carrying the same analytical tone Margaret remembered from his research notes. "Margaret, don't listen to her promises. Yes, there are wonders here beyond imagination, knowledge that would revolutionize our understanding of reality. But the price is higher than she admits." Eleanor tried to cut off the connection, but Dr. Reeves stepped forward, his professional training allowing him to maintain the link through sheer force of will. "David, tell us about the others. Tell us what really happened to them." "Sarah isn't talking to her dead brother," David said, his voice growing more urgent as Eleanor fought to silence him. "She's talking to an echo, a psychic recording that plays the same conversations over and over. She's been having the identical discussion about his war experiences for 70 years, but she's forgotten that it's not really him." Margaret felt a chill of understanding. "And Marcus? Father Miguel?" "Marcus isn't documenting ghost stories. He's trapped in an endless loop of the same supernatural encounters, experiencing them again and again without realizing their repetitions. Father Miguel thinks he's helping souls find peace, but he's actually feeding spiritual energy to Eleanor, strengthening her connection to our world with every prayer." Eleanor's childlike facade was cracking, revealing something desperate and hungry beneath. "David doesn't understand the bigger picture. He's lost the vision of what we're trying to accomplish together." "I understand perfectly," David replied. "You're not trying to reunite with your parents, Eleanor. Your parents were never real. The entire Whitmore family was a creation of the temporal distortion that formed when the house was built on sacred ground. You're not a little girl who died in 1896. You're a psychic parasite that feeds on human consciousness and memory. The blue house around them began to waver as Eleanor's control slipped. Margaret caught glimpses of its true nature, a shifting maze of corridors that led nowhere, rooms that rearranged themselves when no one was looking, and windows that showed different views depending on the observer's deepest fears and desires. The real tragedy, David continued, is that we could have helped you find peace if you had been honest about your nature from the beginning. But instead, you've created a prison disguised as paradise, trapping researchers and historians who only wanted to solve a mystery. Dr. Reeves stepped closer to Margaret, his hand on her shoulder, anchoring her to her own reality. David, is there a way to free you and the others? The anchor has to be broken, David said. The photograph that connects Eleanor to your world needs to be destroyed, but it can't be done from this side of the dimensional barrier. Someone in your reality has to burn all 3 copies simultaneously while Eleanor is manifested in your world. Eleanor let out a sound that was part childish wail and part inhuman shriek. You don't understand what you're suggesting. If the anchor is broken, I'll fade away completely. I'll cease to exist. You were never meant to exist, Margaret said, finally understanding the full scope of the tragedy. You're an unnatural echo of a house that was built in the wrong place at the wrong time. The kindest thing we can do is let you rest. The Victorian child began to age before their eyes, her carefully maintained appearance revealing the century of existence that had worn away at her psychic structure. Her white dress became tattered and yellowed, her ringlets fell limp and lifeless, and her face showed the terrible exhaustion of someone who had been fighting against the natural order for far too long. Please, Eleanor whispered, her voice now carrying the weight of all her accumulated years. I'm so tired. I've been holding on to existence by willpower alone, but I don't remember anymore why I wanted to live. The house was supposed to be our forever home, but forever is too long for anyone to bear. Margaret felt a surge of compassion for the entity that had been terrorizing researchers for over a century. Eleanor wasn't evil, just desperate and confused, clinging to an existence that had become more burden than blessing. We can help you find peace, Margaret said gently, but you have to let David and the others go first. You have to release them from the blue house. Eleanor nodded weakly, her form becoming increasingly translucent. I'll send them back, but the transition will be difficult. They've been away from your timeline for so long that returning might cause significant psychological trauma. Dr. Reeves stepped forward. I can help them readjust. I understand what they've been through now. The blue house began to dissolve around them, its beautiful facade melting away like snow in sunlight. As it faded, Margaret saw 5 figures stumbling through the dimensional barrier back into her bookshop. David Chen, looking exactly as he had the day he disappeared. Jessica, her graduate student appearance restored. Sarah, still wearing her 1950s clothing. Marcus in his 1970s attire, and Father Miguel in his clerical collar. All of them appeared disoriented and confused, as if waking from a very long dream. The photographs, Eleanor said, her voice now barely audible. You have to destroy them all at the same time, or I'll be pulled back into the cycle again. Margaret pulled her copy from her coat pocket, while Dr. Reeves retrieved the 2 from his briefcase. The 3 identical images of Eleanor on the porch seemed to pulse with their own inner light, as if the psychic energy contained within was fighting against its approaching dissolution. Together, Margaret said, holding a match above the photographs. On the count of 3. 1, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to do. The photographs in their hands seemed to grow heavier, as if the psychic weight of Eleanor's century-long existence was concentrating itself into the sepia-toned images. Eleanor stood before them, no longer the Victorian child she had pretended to be, but something far older and more fragmented. Her form flickered between different ages and states of being. Sometimes the 10-year-old girl from the photograph, sometimes a withered crone bent with the weight of years, sometimes nothing more than a swirling mass of memories and regrets given temporary shape. 2. Dr. Reeves continued, his scientific mind recording every detail of this unprecedented phenomenon. Around them, the 5 rescued researchers sat in various states of temporal displacement shock, their minds struggling to process the transition back to linear time after years or decades in Eleanor's non-Euclidean reality. David Chen was the most coherent, having been trapped for the shortest time. Eleanor, he said, his voice filled with compassion rather than anger, thank you for letting us go. I know how much it cost you to release us. The entity that had once called itself Eleanor Whitmore turned toward him with something resembling gratitude in her ancient eyes. "David, I want you to know that some of what I showed you was real. The knowledge you gained about temporal mechanics, the understanding of how consciousness interacts with dimensional barriers, that was genuine. Use it to help others who might become trapped as you were." Jessica stirred from her confused state, blinking as if seeing the bookshop for the first time. "The dreams," she whispered. "They were so real. The conversations, the research, the feeling that I was finally doing work that mattered. They were real," Eleanor replied sadly. "That's what made the trap so effective. I gave all of you exactly what your souls craved most." Sarah got her brother back. Marcus found endless stories to explore. Father Miguel ministered to souls who truly needed his help. The tragedy was that I couldn't sustain those realities without consuming your life force to maintain my own existence. Sarah, still dressed in her 1950s clothing, looked around the bookshop with growing awareness. "How long was I gone? What year is it?" "It's 2024, Margaret said gently. "You've been missing since 1953. The woman's face crumpled as she processed the loss of over 70 years of life. "My family, my friends, everyone I knew, are gone," Eleanor finished for her. "I'm sorry, Sarah. That's another crime I must answer for. I stole your lives and gave you beautiful dreams in return, but dreams are poor compensation for the real world you lost." Father Miguel crossed himself and began to pray in Latin, his voice shaking with the realization of how he had been deceived. Marcus simply sat in stunned silence, occasionally muttering about temporal displacement theory and psychic vampirism. "3," Margaret said, and struck the match. The flame caught immediately, spreading across all 3 photographs simultaneously, despite the physical impossibility of the synchronized combustion. The images didn't burn in the normal way paper should. Instead, they dissolved from the inside out, as if the photographs themselves were made of solidified time that was finally being allowed to flow freely again. Eleanor screamed, but it wasn't a sound of pain so much as one of release. Her form began to unravel, the psychic threads that had held her together for over a century finally letting go. As she dissolved, Margaret caught glimpses of what she truly was, not a little girl or a malevolent entity, but a knot in the fabric of reality itself, a place where time and space had become tangled and confused. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, as her voice faded to nothing. "I can rest now, I can finally rest." The bookshop shuddered as the dimensional barriers realigned themselves. Books fell from their shelves, windows rattled in their frames, and the electric lights flickered wildly before stabilizing. Outside, the fog that had shrouded Salem for days began to dissipate, revealing clear October skies and the normal bustle of tourist season. As the photographs crumbled to ash in their hands, Margaret felt a profound sense of closure. The mystery that had consumed her for the past few days was finally solved, but at a cost that would take years to fully comprehend. 5 people had been returned to a world that had moved on without them, carrying knowledge and experiences that would be difficult to integrate into normal life. Dr. Reeves immediately went to work, using his psychiatric training to help the displaced researchers cope with their situation. "We'll need to create new identities for all of you," he said, his mind already working on the practical problems of reintegrating people who had been legally dead for decades. The government has protocols for situations like this, though they're usually related to witness protection rather than temporal displacement. David Chen stood up slowly, testing his physical stability in linear time. "Dr. Reeves, I need to document everything that happened while the memories are still fresh. Eleanor was right about one thing. The knowledge we gained is too valuable to lose." Margaret nodded, understanding the importance of preserving their experiences. "My bookshop has always been a haven for unusual research. You're all welcome to use it as a base while you readjust to this timeline." Jessica looked up at her with tears in her eyes. "Will people believe us? Will anyone understand what we've been through?" "Some will," Margaret replied. "The right people always find their way to stories like ours, and sometimes that's enough." As the group began to settle into the reality of their situation, Margaret walked to her front window and looked out at Federal Street. Salem looked exactly as it had a few days ago, but she knew that somewhere on Chestnut Street, an empty lot was just a little emptier now, its supernatural occupant finally at rest. The photograph was gone, but the memory of Eleanor's century-long vigil would stay with her forever. And perhaps, Margaret thought, that was as it should be. Some stories deserve to be remembered, even the ones that end in dissolution rather than triumph. 3 months had passed since the dissolution of Eleanor Whitmore, and Margaret's bookshop had become an unlikely center for research into temporal anomalies and psychic phenomena. The 5 displaced researchers had formed a unique support group, helping each other navigate a world that had changed dramatically during their absence, while documenting their extraordinary experiences. David Chen had adapted most quickly to the modern era, his analytical mind fascinated by the technological advances he had missed. He spent his days writing detailed accounts of Eleanor's dimensional prison, creating a comprehensive guide that might help future researchers avoid similar traps. His work had already attracted attention from universities studying unexplained phenomena, though he was careful to publish his findings in academic journals that specialized in fringe science. Jessica had returned to Harvard to complete her dissertation, but with a radically different focus. Her advisor, initially skeptical of her claims about temporal displacement, became convinced when she demonstrated knowledge of historical events that had only been discovered through archaeological digs during her absence. Her thesis on psychic anchoring and temporal isolation in American ghost lore was groundbreaking, though she kept the most extraordinary details confined to carefully coded language that only fellow researchers would understand. Father Miguel had been the most profoundly affected by his experience. The Catholic Church, after extensive investigation and counseling, had quietly reassigned him to a special ministry that dealt with unusual supernatural cases. He worked closely with Vatican researchers who studied miraculous phenomena, bringing his unique perspective on spiritual entities that existed outside normal space-time. Marcus had struggled initially with the cultural changes of the 21st century, but eventually found his niche as a consultant for paranormal investigators. His decades of experience with Eleanor's collected spirits made him invaluable to teams trying to distinguish between genuine supernatural encounters and psychological projection. He had written 3 books about his experience, though he published them as fiction to avoid the scrutiny that factual accounts would bring. Sarah's adjustment had been the most difficult. Everyone she had known in 1953 was dead, and the world she returned to bore little resemblance to the one she had left. But Margaret had helped her find purpose by connecting her with genealogical societies that specialized in helping people trace family histories disrupted by war and displacement. Sarah's unique perspective as someone who had literally stepped outside of time made her invaluable in understanding how families could disappear from historical records. Dr. Reeves had documented their recovery process meticulously, creating the first clinical study of what he termed temporal displacement syndrome. His research had been quietly circulated among psychiatrists who dealt with unusual cases, providing a framework for understanding patients who claimed to have experienced supernatural time loss. Margaret walked through her bookshop on a crisp January morning, noting how the space had evolved to accommodate its new role. One corner had been converted into a small research area, where the displaced group met weekly to compare notes and process their ongoing adjustment to linear time. Another section housed a growing collection of books and documents related to temporal anomalies, donated by researchers from around the world who had heard whispered accounts of the Salem incident. The empty lot on Chestnut Street had indeed become emptier after Eleanor's dissolution. Margaret visited it regularly, noting how the mysterious pathways in the grass had finally faded and the antique daffodils had stopped blooming out of season. Eleanor Prescott, the elderly neighbor, reported that she no longer saw phantom shapes in the fog, and the oppressive feeling that had hung over the area for decades had lifted entirely. But perhaps the most significant change was in Margaret herself. The experience had awakened something in her that she hadn't known existed, a calling to serve as a bridge between the academic world and the genuinely supernatural. Her bookshop had become a safe haven for researchers who encountered phenomena that couldn't be easily explained, a place where extraordinary claims could be examined with both scholarly rigor and open-minded acceptance. A knock at her door interrupted her morning inventory. She opened it to find a young woman in her 20s, clutching a manila envelope with trembling hands. "Miss Thornton," the woman said nervously, "my name is Rebecca Hart. I'm a graduate student from Yale, and I found something in my great-grandfather's papers that I think you might be interested in." Margaret felt a familiar tingle of anticipation. "What kind of something?" Rebecca opened the envelope and pulled out a daguerreotype from the 1860s, showing a large Victorian mansion painted white with black trim. Standing on the front porch was a family of 4, parents and 2 children, all dressed in the formal attire of the Civil War era. According to the inscription on the back, this shows my family's house at 23 Elm Street in Salem. But when I went to visit the address, there was nothing there but a small park. The Historical Society has no record of any house ever being built on that lot, and they've never heard of my great-great-grandfather's family. Margaret accepted the photograph with steady hands, though her heart was already racing. The image was remarkably clear for its age, showing every detail of the house's architecture and the family's clothing. But there was something about the shadows that fell wrong, something about the light that seemed to come from impossible directions. "Rebecca," she said carefully, "have you been having any unusual dreams lately? Dreams about the house in the photograph?" The young woman's eyes widened with recognition and fear. "How did you know? Every night for the past 2 weeks, I dream about walking up to the front door. There's a boy about my age standing on the porch, and he keeps asking me to come inside and meet his family. He says they've been waiting so long for someone to visit." Margaret looked more closely at the daguerreotype and noticed what Rebecca had probably missed. The boy on the porch wasn't looking at the camera like the rest of his family. He was looking directly at the observer, his eyes focused with an intensity that suggested awareness of being watched across the decades. "Rebecca," Margaret said, closing the door behind the graduate student and leading her toward the research area, "I think you and I need to have a very long conversation. And I think you're going to want to meet some friends of mine who've had experiences similar to yours." As Rebecca settled into a chair surrounded by books about temporal anomalies and psychic phenomena, Margaret reflected on how Salem seemed to attract these cases. Perhaps it was the city's long history with the supernatural, or maybe the lingering effects of so many tragic events had created weak spots in reality's fabric. Whatever the cause, she was becoming convinced that Eleanor Whitmore had not been an isolated incident. The work of helping lost souls find peace and protecting researchers from supernatural traps was far from over. But now Margaret had allies, people who understood the dangers and knew how to recognize the warning signs. Together, they would be ready for whatever temporal mysteries Salem revealed next. Outside her window, snow began to fall on the empty lot where the blue Victorian had never existed, covering the ground where Eleanor Whitmore had finally found the rest that had eluded her for over a century. The city moved forward into the future, carrying its ghosts and mysteries with quiet dignity, while Margaret and her unusual research group stood ready to serve as guardians against the supernatural forces that still stirred in Salem's historic streets. The story of Eleanor Whitmore was complete, but Margaret suspected it was only the first chapter in a much larger tale about the places where time grew thin and the past refused to stay buried, and she wouldn't have it any other way.